Okay, this is the combined lecture on plants. Remember, the book, there's many chapters that talk about different aspects of plants. We have just one sort of combined lecture, just pulling main points from each of those chapters. And remember, the individual chapters, the PowerPoints and everything are on Moodle in case you want to take a look at those. So in terms of this first part just talks about ancestry and basically just features of land plants. And so plants are all multicellular and they're photosynthetic, right? They're eukaryotes. And the way that we classify plants, right, we're going to use both molecular information, like we talked about before when we were talking about classifying, the protists and talk about classifying animals, but also morphological information as well. So they're thought to have evolved, from a freshwater green algae. We'll talk a little bit about this, and we've mentioned this before, about 450 or about 500 million years ago. So green algae contain chlorophylls and accessory pigments, right? They can photosynthesize. They store excess carbohydrates as starch, just like plants, and they also have cellulose in their cell walls. So because of those characteristics and other reasons as well, including molecular data, it's believed that plants have evolved from these green algae. Okay, if you look at that last bullet point there, it says the difference between plants and algae is that besides protecting the zygote, right? So plants can protect that zygote. They also protect and nourish the embryo as well. Okay, and so that freshwater green algae, we've mentioned this again before when we talked about the protists, is called a charophyte or a charophyte. And so this, the common ancestor to these doesn't exist anymore. But some of those characteristics that are common, which we already just talked about when we talked about the green algae, are cellulose in the cell walls, apical cells, we'll talk about those, plasmodesmata. We mentioned this back in Bio 111 or Fundamentals 1. They're basically sort of spaces between the cell wall that allow adjacent cells to communicate with each other, right? And also placenta, basically where you can, retain and care for the zygote. Okay, but like we said with plants, they also can protect the embryo as well. Okay, so this is just showing you green algae that are closely related to land plants. So we've mentioned these guys before. Okay, so this is showing you here. This is embryo of a green algae, and you can see the embryo and it's unprotected. However, in plants, the embryo is protected and nourished, right, by the seed. Okay, so this is again an adaptation that makes plants, obviously more complex and, more suited. This embryo can survive harsh environments and things like that because of the seed that protects it. Okay. All right, so in terms of how we break down or categorize plants, you can see this, here again, we've seen these phylogenetic trees, often, and we'll see more of them as we talk more about animals as well. But here is just showing you this common, right, green algae ancestor. And then you can kind of see how these things branch off in terms of what types of traits, right, derived traits you see here, right? So this here, or everyone kind of over to the right, is going to have embryo protection. Remember, we said just the green algae, right? Those charophytes are that they don't have that protection for the embryo, but every other plant here, which these are all the plants, does have embryo protection, right? And again, you're going to see some of these other traits that have separated out some of these groups as you move along, okay? So again, if you look here in terms of broadest groups, right? So non-vascular plants versus vascular plants, okay? And so those non-vascular plants, you have the bryophytes here. So another word for those, and these are liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. So these are low-lying plants, right? They don't have vascular tissue, meaning they can't transport water up, high, and so therefore they have to be low-lying in order to access and have, access to water and nutrients that they need. If we look here now in vascular plants, and we'll talk a little bit more about vascular system in a plant and things like that as we move later on in the lecture. But in terms of vascular plants, you have them broken down into seedless and also those with seeds. Okay, so lycophytes here and ferns and allies are seedless plants. And then those plants with seeds, gymnosperms and flowering plants. Okay, And now when you guys do your plant projects, you're going to have to categorize, 4 plants that were grown in that greenhouse, based on these groups here. And so I think I refer to this in the assignment description. So in terms of some more details about these different groups, right? So these are all the same groups that were in this phylogenetic tree here, except with some description, right? So it gives you just some main characteristics, right? So here are the charophytes. Again, the sort of most simplest, right, type that came from that common green algal ancestor. And they're really separated out from the rest of these plant groups that have the embryo protection, okay? So when we talk about land plants, right, so these guys are completely in water, okay? But there are some shared traits. So land plants, we'll talk a little bit about this, but they all have this something called an alternation of generations life cycle. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, bryophytes, right? These are non-vascular plants, okay? It says it here, low-lying non-vascular plants that prefer moist locations, okay? Liverworts, hornworts, and mosses are all bryophytes. Then we have the vascular plants, right? So lycophytes, ferns and allies, and then you have the seed plants, okay? So in terms of these guys, these do not have seeds, right? And these are the seed plants, okay? But all of these are vascular, okay? And so you can take a look at this and read this in a little more detail to look at what characteristics each one of these groups has, okay? So when you think about gymnosperms, these are, like you think of a pine tree, right? They're large, they're cone-bearing. Angiosperms are the flowering plants, okay? And so we're probably most familiar with these two groups here. Okay, so in terms of some of the features of these land plants and some adaptations, again, some of these may seem obvious, right? So to conserve water, that land plant has a waxy cuticle that basically covers it and protects it from drying out. And so it still will allow carbon dioxide and, to enter so that photosynthesis can continue, but it also provides that protection that the plants need from drying out, okay? So there are tiny openings called stomata that allow carbon dioxide to get in and oxygen to get out. I mentioned vascular system before. I mentioned sort of non-vascular versus vascular plants. So if we're talking about a vascular plant, a vascular system will be able to transport water in the body of the plant, okay? And we'll talk a little bit again specifically about the vascular system. But this is something that's part of the vascular system, these tracheids that are within it, okay? Three-dimensional tissues, right? And so they're, again, that can hold water, right? And so that, again, helps avoid water loss. Also, because land plants are exposed to more UV intensity than aquatic algae, there are adaptations to deal with that as well. Okay, and so this is just showing you, right, again, if you feel the leaf of a plant, you feel that sort of waxy cuticle, and you guys know what that feels like. That's obvious, and you can see this water beating up. This is going to prevent water loss. And I mentioned these stomata. These are the openings there that will allow carbon dioxide to get in and oxygen to leave. So most of the photosynthesis, right, is going to occur on the green leaves. They're green, lots of pigments there, chlorophyll, and lots of surface area. Okay. In terms of the life cycle, I mentioned this, all land plants will exhibit this alternation of generations life cycle, okay? And so there's two alternating forms within the course of a plant's life, and they alternate between haploid and diploid phases. So I'll show you a picture in a second. But so here, in terms of 1N, remember that's haploid, those are called gametophytes, right? And if you talk about the diploid form, they're called sporophytes, okay? And so again, then those sporophytes will produce spores by meiosis, right? So these are all things we've talked about before in General Biology 1 or Fundamentals of Biology 1 in terms of haploid and diploid, right, and meiosis. Okay, so it says the haploid spore will then develop into a new organism without fusing it with another reproductive cell. So if you think about human reproduction, right, we have haploid cells are sex cells that are produced by meiosis, but then they join together, right, to form that new organism. Here, that haploid spore can just develop into a new organism without fusing with another cell, okay? And so you end up with this multicellular gametophyte. Okay. And so that's what this is telling you here. So then those gametophytes, okay, can actually fuse to form a zygote, and then you have that diploid sporophyte that can form. Okay, so that's what this is showing you here. Again, these sort of alternate forms. Okay, haploid and diploid. So this basically what's shown in this, alternation of generations diagram here is explained in that last slide. So if we talk about and I'll show you another picture that deals with this here. If you talk about what the dominant generation is, right? It depends, okay? So it says they'll differ in terms of which is dominant, meaning the gametophyte versus the sporophyte, okay? So in mosses, the gametophyte is dominant. And so if you go back, remember that the gametophyte is the haploid version, right? Or the haploid form, okay? In ferns, pine trees, peach trees, the sporophyte is dominant, okay? And it does say the shift from a sporophyte dominance is more of an adaptation to land. Okay, so again, remember these mosses are low-lying, non-vascular plants that need to be in moist locations. As we're talking about taller trees and taller plants like that, mostly you'll see the sporophyte being dominant. Okay, and the gametophyte will be reduced in size. Right, and so this is what this is showing you here. Right, so here's the moss. Right, in the ferns, again, these sort of more low-lying plants, right? The gametophyte is more dominant here, okay? And so it's just showing you the production of the spores or what have you. Now, if you look at the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, again, these are like pine trees, right? Flowering trees. You can see that the gametophyte is just this small, tiny little form here that you basically don't see, right? You only see the sporophyte form, okay? All right. So let's talk a little bit about the cells and the tissues of these flowering plants in particular, okay? So again, you have a cell as a basic unit of life. There are specialized tissues in plants, and there's also organs, okay? And so if you talk about when a plant embryo first develops, you basically form these meristem cells. So these are stem cells, right? Just like if we talk about, during human development, you're starting with a single cell and you get lots of cell division that occurs. Again, these stem cells, right? Embryonic stem cells. So there's a pool of them that will remain undifferentiated and keep dividing. So again, they'll remain stem cells, but they also can differentiate into specific cell types, okay? All right. So, but maintaining those meristem cells throughout life allows plants to keep growing, right? And so that's the way that they're allowed to keep growing throughout life. So at the tips of stems and roots, you have something called an apical meristem, which is where you have the length and the growth occurring, okay? Within that apical meristem, there's 3 types of meristem, which basically produce 3 different types of tissues. Okay, so epidermal tissue, ground tissue, and vascular tissue. So again, if you think about us, you think about animals, right? You think about humans, we have muscle tissue, right? We have nervous tissue, same idea. In plants, epidermal tissue, ground tissue, and vascular tissue. And so this is just this is showing you this meristem population and the cell division occurring, and then the differentiation into those different cell types. So think about maybe this differentiated into an epidermis cell, right? Just like we and then multiple epidermis cells, will make up the tissue, okay? All right, and so this is just showing you this again. Again, the different types are parts of the apical meristem, right? Which will give rise to these different types of tissue that I just mentioned, okay? So in terms of the function, right? Epidermal tissue forms the outer protective covering like we talked about already. Ground tissue basically fills the interior of the plant. Vascular tissue is what's going to transport water and nutrients through the plant. Again, remember we talked about non-vascular versus vascular plants. Non-vascular plants like mosses will not have vascular tissue, okay? All right, so again, just a little bit more about the epidermal tissue. I think I probably said most of this in terms of what you guys need to know. You don't need to worry about all these sort of specific terms here, okay? All right, so just kind of showing you that there are some epidermal cells that will have hairs that will help increase the surface area of the root for water absorption, right? And you probably have seen this if you pulled up a plant and looked at the root, it has these sort of root hairs that will increase the surface area. Again, these are all, epidermis is all, tissue that's going to form the outside of the plant, okay? All right. So in older woody plants, right, the epidermis of the stem is replaced by something called the periderm. Okay, so it says it's the major component of cork. All right, so in terms of that ground tissue, right, what's in that ground tissue? There are specific types of, cell types, okay? So this is showing you these two different cell types, parenchyma cells and collenchyma cells, and just to give you a basic function for these guys here, okay? So these parenchyma cells contain chloroplasts, perform photosynthesis. These guys provide flexible support, okay? And so it says strands and celery stalks, again, they're providing the support for the plant, okay? Whereas these guys are the cells that you're gonna actually see photosynthesis occurring in, okay? Again, another type of cell within that ground tissue. Again, this is the tissue that makes up the inside of the plant. There's sclerenchyma cells, okay? And so these guys have thick secondary walls and they have something called lignin in them. And most are actually non-living at maturity. And again, they're going to support those mature regions of the plant, okay? And so again, they're there for support. So they're kind of sort of two types, these ones that are fibers, right? Long and slender. And so if you think about hemp and rope, it's those types, it's the types of cells that are there, okay? So if you're talking about shorter cells or types of cells, seed coats, nutshells, right? Super hard, those are going to be composed of these types of cells here. All right, and so this is just showing you what some of these cell types look like, okay? So these parenchyma cells, again, these are all cells that are part of the inside of the plant, the ground tissue of the plant. Okay, so that brings us to vascular tissue. So two main types of vascular tissue, or sort of two main structures, I guess, or organs that you're going to think of when you think about the vascular system of the plant or the vascular tissue. So xylem, okay? So the xylem, you need to know this, xylem transports water and minerals from the roots to the leaves. So you need to know what xylem is and what the function is. Its function is to transport water and minerals from the roots to the leaves. So like I said, mosses, those non-vascular plants, do not have a xylem, okay? So they cannot transport water from the roots up to the leaves. And if you think about a tall tree, all the way up to those leaves, right? And so that's why they need to remain low-lying and in a moist environment, okay? Within the xylem, you have, and I mentioned these, I think, earlier on, you have something called tracheids. And these are basically, I'll show you a picture, but there's kind of these long, sort of oblong-shaped structures, okay? And then you also have vessel elements, right? And again, the function of these is to allow for the transport of water and minerals from the roots to the leaves, okay? Oh, sorry, this was showing you, I guess this should have been one slide before, that's my fault. This is just showing you some modifications of those epidermal cells. Remember I said about root hairs, right? So again, anything that's sort of protruding to the outside of the plant is going to be a modification of epidermal tissue because that's the outer covering. Sorry to sort of a side note. So now here's xylem structure. Again, you can, this is an actual picture here, but you can see this is pointing out these tracheids, right? And then these vessel elements. Again, all of them are going to serve function in order to allow that water to be transported pretty long distances in some cases, right? From the roots all the way to the leaves, basically to every single part of the plant, okay? And so this is now showing you there are actually two different types of vessels, okay? And again, there's lots more we could talk about here in terms of how that water is actually transported and what the function of each one of these elements is, but you don't need to worry about that, okay? We need to know what xylem is and what the function of the xylem is just in general, okay? Not these necessarily these specific structures within the xylem. Okay, another main type of vascular tissue is something called the phloem. Okay, so the phloem will transport sucrose and other organic compounds from the leaves to the roots. Because remember what's happening in the leaves? Photosynthesis. What's the function of photosynthesis? To produce carbohydrates, right? The plant's able to make their own food. So once that food is made in the leaves, it then has to be distributed to the rest of the plant. Okay, so right? Sucrose, whatever, glucose, any other organic compounds or carbohydrates that are made basically through photosynthesis are transported to the rest of the plant, right? Through the phloem, okay? So the xylem transports water from the roots to the leaves. The phloem basically takes all of those carbohydrates that are being made from photosynthesis and transports them to the rest of the plant, okay? And again, these are some structures within the phloem. So something called sieve tube members, and they're there as conducting cells to be able to basically, transport these carbohydrates around. Okay. And again, you don't need to know about the specifics there. And so this is showing you again, I mean, it looks similar if you think about like a blood vessel, right? In a human, you see some similarities in terms of the structure. Again, you don't need to know all these specific, different structures of this. We want to know what phloem is, right, and what its function is. Okay. All right. So in terms of some organs of flowering plants, okay, there are many structural features that they share. Obviously, there's a lot of diversity within the flowering plants as well. So vegetative organs, right, are all plant parts except the reproductive structures, okay? So anything besides the reproductive structures, they're there for growth and nutrition, okay? So the three vegetative organs that you're going to think of are roots, stems, and leaves, okay? So most of these flowering plants will have something called a root system and a shoot system. Root system, obviously roots, right, that are in the ground that are going to be able to take up minerals and water from the soil. Shoot system, stems, and leaves, okay? All right, flowers, seeds, fruits, these are all involved in reproduction. Again, this is involved in nutrition and growth. These are all involved in reproduction. Okay, so if you look at just a basic plant body here, again, you can see the roots here, the root system, right? And then the rest of this is the shoot system, okay, showing you some of the vascular tissues that we talked about within the plant there. Okay, so in terms of stems, again, we're talking about this part of the shoot system, okay, main axis of the plant, and then basically leaves are going to elongate and sort of branch off from that stem, okay? And so again, if you want to talk about some other terminology, nodes versus internodes, okay, we don't need to know every single specifics, every single sort of specific structure, again, like I said before. Okay, stem also has vascular tissue that transports water and minerals, obviously, right? We said we need to get the water from the roots all the way up to, say, the top of the plant. The vascular system is going to be within the stem, okay? And pretty much within, the whole part of the plant, okay? Through the leaves, too. All right, so major leaves, as I said this already before, right? Leaves, major part of the plant that carries on photosynthesis, okay? And so if you want to talk about different parts of the actual leaf, right? The blade versus the petiole, okay? Those are the sort of two main parts of the actual leaf, okay? In terms of some other types of leaves, right? Tendrils are leaves that can attach to objects. I'm sure you've seen plants that can do that. And then bulbs are actually leaves that will store food. Okay. Now, if we talk a little bit more about, another way of sort of categorizing plants here, monocots versus eudicots. And the reason why you call them monocot is that one has a single cotyledon and the other one has more than one. Okay, so it says 2 cotyledons or more. Okay, and basically the cotyledons are just transfer tissue, tissue that is sort of within the wait, let me just show you here, right? Within the seed, and help nourish the embryo. Okay, so that's where this cotyledon, that's what that is. Okay, just so you know, because I didn't really introduce it, I guess, that well. So the cotyledons, like I said, they'll supply nutrients to the seedlings. Okay, so if you look at this is just kind of just showing you some sort of this sort of development early on of the plant. Again, it's probably a little bit out of order. I'm not going to hold you guys responsible for the different parts. Any of these diagrams, I don't expect you guys to, maybe some main diagram of the plant, like be able to identify the stems versus the leaves versus the roots, right? But other than that, we're not going to worry about specifics. So this is showing you the difference between monocots and eudicots. And again, within the seed, you have one cotyledon versus more than one. However, there are also other differences if you look within the root versus the stem versus the leaves, right? And so you can determine whether it's a eudicot or a monocot based on this. And again, this is another way that we categorize plants, okay? So again, main difference, right? A monocot, one cotyledon, eudicote, two cotyledons, or more than that, okay? You can have more than two. And then again, these are differences here. So for the root, okay, the xylem and the phloem is actually in this ring shape. If you look at the root, and so this is basically taking a cross section through the root. If you look at the root of a eudicote, right, you can see that the root phloem is between the arms of the xylem here. Okay, so xylem, and then you can see the phloem is in blue. All right. Again, if you look at the stem, you can see how the vascular bundles, again, blue and red, are the xylem and the phloem. You can see that there's a different pattern. Again, this is taking a cross section, but this is through the stem now. Leaf patterns are going to be different in shapes, and also the flower parts are going to be different. Okay, so these are ways of identifying the difference between a monocot and a eudicote. So if we talk a little bit more about some of these organs and life cycles, okay, it says annual plants will live for only one growing season, right? So I don't know if anyone plants stuff in their garden or whatever. You've heard the terms maybe annual versus perennial. The difference is that annual plants will only live for one growing season, okay? They produce enough vegetative structures to support the flower and the seeds, and then after seed dispersal, the plant dies. For perennials, they'll live for 3 or even more seasons, okay? These spend energy making vegetative structures, which will help the plant survive for years. So the difference is in those vegetative structures that are going to support that plant. Okay, so this is actually just talking about some of the actual genes that are involved in allowing a plant to be a perennial versus an annual, right? So scientists have targeted specific genes involved. You don't need to memorize these genes. Okay, so this is again just kind of showing you plant nutrition here, a little bit more about it. I think we know the basics of photosynthesis, right? I already told you that photosynthesis is happening at the leaves. If we talk about photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is taken in by the plant, right? Through those stomata. That carbon dioxide then gets converted into carbohydrates, right? The process of photosynthesis, you have oxygen that's released and also some water as well, okay? And so the plant can make its own carbohydrates, gets transported around. If you talk about what's coming in through the roots here, again, you got, oxygen being taken up here, carbon dioxide being released, minerals and water are taken in there, okay? All right, so in terms of some sort of essential nutrients, so about 95% of a plant's dry weight is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, okay? The primary nutrients are carbon dioxide and water, right? Again, because we're talking about making, food and going through photosynthesis. Also, the plant cells have mitochondria, and cellular respiration is occurring there too, right? To provide energy for all the other cellular functions, okay? It says a nutrient is essential. Well, sorry, we talk about minerals, right? Because I kind of been mentioning minerals being taken up by the soil. It's an inorganic substance, right? That usually contains 2 or more elements, okay? So if we're talking about inorganic, it's not going to be, carbon, it's going to be a substance that contains carbon. Okay, so if it's essential, it has an identifiable role. Another nutrient cannot substitute for it. And if the plant has a deficiency of that nutrient, the plant will die. Okay, and so you can divide these essential nutrients into macro and micro. And so these are them here, right? So macronutrients: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, right? Potassium, okay? Calcium, magnesium. If you talk about micronutrients, right? Iron, okay? Manganese, zinc, okay? These are all micronutrients that are, again, they're necessary. And they're essential, right? So if they are essential, the plant doesn't have one of them or is deficient in one of them, it will die. So you have to make sure that these are supplied in the soil, right? And so especially if you're talking about like potting your own plants and stuff like that, you got to make sure that you have all these essential nutrients available. Okay, so this is just showing you that there, and in case you forgot some of the abbreviations, it's reminding you what they are. Okay, so beneficial nutrients are either required for growth or enhance the growth, so they're not necessarily essential. Okay, and sometimes this will vary, right? So it says horsetails, which is a specific type of plant, requires silicon. right? And sugar beets will show more growth with sodium. That's not necessarily true of every single species of plant, so you do have some differences, okay? All right, I already told you what a mineral was. And again, how is it determined? How do we know what the essential nutrients are? We can grow plants in the lab and ask questions. And so one way that plants are grown in the lab, not the only way, is using hydroponics, right? And so basically, there's really no soil. It's water kind of within it, and within that are all the nutrients that are needed, right? And so you can easily control what's in there and pull things away to see how it affects growth. Okay. And so that's what this is telling you here. So omitting a particular nutrient from a liquid media, you can basically see what happens to the plant there. Okay. I think I already kind of talked about this. So NPK ratio describes the percentage by weight of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And like I mentioned above, some plants need different ratios of these things, right? Or will grow better with more sodium, like we mentioned, or something like that. All right, so this is showing you fertilizer, right? These are some things that might happen to the plant that might help you identify what's missing, right? Or what they're deficient in. Okay, and again, I think some of you guys, when you worked in the greenhouse, may have mixed soil and things like that. And so you can kind of, based on what we said, you can see how important it is to have the proper soil, right? And to make sure that soil has what that plant needs. Okay, so in terms of soil in general, mineral particles, decaying organic material, living organisms, air, water, that's all part of the soil. Okay, and in terms of how does that actually form, right? If you're talking about weathering rock, right, or just starting off with rock, there are organisms that will help degrade that rock and actually could, over time, turn it into soil, okay? So, like lichens, right? Remember we mentioned those, and you see them on the bark of the trees? And also mosses are ones that can kind of, grow on the side of a rock or something like that and help sort of break that down, right? And so, we just mentioned those guys. So lichens, mosses play a key role in the sort of development of soil. If you talk about this word humus or humus, it's decaying organic material that may eventually turn into soil. Okay. This next part is just actually talking about the development of the embryo. And so again, remember we said if you're talking about a eudicot, and you can look at the development between a monocot and a eudicot and follow that and see how what the differences are. Remember, a eudicot has two cotyledons, and those cotyledons provide nutrients to the developing embryo. Okay, and so this is basically just showing you these stages. Again, I don't expect you guys to memorize these stages, but it's just meant to be illustrative to follow that process. Okay, and so this is showing you, a specific. This is the specific species we're talking about, and this is actually a species that's used a lot in the lab, even for plant genetics and things like that. And they're easy to grow. Okay, so you can kind of see here's your endosperm nucleus, the zygote, right? And then basically you can see the embryo is going to form, right? And you can follow this along here. Okay, so these cotyledons are appearing, right? And they're going to help nourish that embryo. Okay, the cotyledons are now obvious, right? You can see them here that there's two because we said this is a eudicot. And again, you can keep following along here. Nobody needs to memorize details. Okay, again, just to remind you, right, a monocot versus a eudicot. Okay, so this is showing you the two in the eudicot and then one in the monocot. So this is a corm. Okay, so in terms of now, you're right. We were talking about this, embryo within a seed, right? So we want to, if we're talking about reproduction and things like that, you got to talk about seed dispersal, right? And basically, again, the sort of protection of that embryo or what's nourishing it. So when you talk about a fruit, it's a mature ovary, okay? And so there are simple fruits, there are compound fruits, okay? So simple fruits are derived from a single ovary. Okay, compound fruits develop from several groups of ovaries. So things like, right, and so within these compound fruits, you can have some differences too, like aggregate fruits, like a blackberry, multiple fruits, like a pineapple. So there's ovaries from separate flowers all clustered together in a pineapple. Okay? And so in terms of the development of the fruit, the ovary wall will thicken to become this pericarp, and then you'll have these 3 layers. Okay? So, and again, that's the fruit. So the exocarp is outermost, mesocarp in the middle, and then the endocarp is the boundary right around the seeds. Okay? All right, so in dry fruits, if you talk about a dry fruit, that pericarp is paper, right? So it's not going to be thick and fleshy or anything like that, okay? Paper, leathery, or woody when the fruit is mature, right? So you can talk about legumes. They are, you know, dry fruits. And you can say dehiscent, right? Or indehiscent. And so either the fruit will split open when ripe, or the fruit doesn't split open when ripe. Again, legumes and grains are examples of dry fruits. Okay, and so these are showing you some other examples. So I'm sure we all know what fruits are, right? So anything that has seeds is a fruit, right? Here, this is showing you a legume, right? These are dry fruits, right? Whereas you have fleshy fruits here, right? This is showing you a peach or a nectarine, a tomato. We've all seen these sort of helicopter things around. And so again, these are dry fruit, right? Fruit from many ovaries in a single flower. So remember, this is an aggregate fruit, like a raspberry or a blackberry. And then this is one fruit. So it's many all together, okay? So you see this? This is one little fruit. These are all different little fruits together on that one large pineapple. All right, and so in terms of dispersal of fruits, so dry fruits are dispersed by the wind. Again, think about those helicopters that I just showed you. They get blown around, okay? Many fruits obviously will attract animals, okay, and provide them with food. The animals eat the fruit, right? And then may ingest the seed and then may disperse that seed somewhere else when it essentially comes out in the feces. There are hooks and spines that can attach to dry fruit and basically attached to animal fur and human clothing, and then can be dispersed that way, okay? And so this is basically just showing you this here, right? So in terms of dispersal, right? So those itchy balls, I have a ton of those in my yard. They can get stuck to your dog, they can get stuck to you, and they can be dispersed that way. This is showing you a bird eating a certain type of berry. Again, eats it, and then obviously when it poops, basically you're going to see that those seeds now can be dispersed, okay? Okay, so in terms of germination, and again, this kind of goes back to like we were talking about, you know, the development and things like that, so we're sort of circling back, I guess. So seeds, usually they need to remain dormant for a certain period of time, right? And then once conditions are favorable, they will germinate. Okay, so it says some seeds don't germinate until they've been through a dormant period. And so that dormant period, nothing's going to happen. Okay, they just sit there essentially. Okay, and so again, once environmental conditions are favorable, they will then germinate. So they needs to have oxygen available, right, for metabolic needs. Needs to have adequate warmth for enzyme activity because enzymes are proteins, right? Temperature will greatly affect the function of an enzyme. We talked about that last semester, right? If it's a cold temperature, enzyme activity will be inhibited. Therefore, the plant will not be able to develop properly, right? And so you have to make sure the temperature is right. And also you need to make sure there's an adequate water supply. So when we say environmental conditions need to be favorable, we're talking about these things here. Okay, and so this is basically showing you seed germination. And so what's happening there. So you plant that seed, again, conditions are favorable, there's enough water there, there's enough oxygen available, and you can look at the germination of a monocot here versus a eudicot here, okay? And basically you can see in the seedling of the eudicot, you can see these two cotyledons, okay? Here you can see this first leaf is what you call it in the monocot, okay? And then the plant's going to develop from there. Okay, we're just about done. And so all of that we're talking about basically, you know, sexual reproduction in plants. However, you can also have asexual reproduction as well. And so there are some methods or things that are used for asexual reproduction. So things like stolons. We mentioned these terms before when we talked about fungi, right? So if you think about fungi and how they sort of have this sort of underground network um, of these of essentially, mycelium, it's the same idea. Okay, so these stolons are horizontal stems that will sort of run just above ground. Okay, they also have rhizomes, which are underground stems, which can produce new plants asexually. And then there's nodes on those stems where new growth can basically occur. Okay, and so it says the eyes of white potatoes are buds that can produce a new plant if planted with a portion of that tuber. Okay. And so strawberries grow like this. I don't know if anyone's planted strawberries before, but you'll see they sort of end up sort of taking up a large surface area. Okay, so here's the parent plant. You can see here this stolon here, and then this is an asexually produced offspring. Okay, going to make more strawberries, and then the same thing. You can see it again. It'll kind of take out this sort of vast network or a lot of surface area there. Okay, you can, like I said, you can grow plants in the lab. We talked about hydroponics a little bit. You can actually do tissue culture with plants. Okay, and so if we talk about genetic engineering of plants, this is how it starts. You have to be able to sort of culture these and get at these single cells to make genetic changes. And so you can grow that plant tissue in an artificial liquid or some solid culture media, and then basically, you could take a single cell and essentially you can make a plant from there. So like I said, you can genetically modify that cell and then allow that cell to grow up, right? And then eventually have that plant mate with other plants, and that's how you basically can develop, a genetically modified plants, okay? And so this is just talking about this meristem tissue again, and that I guess it doesn't really matter here, but this is kind of just showing you the steps in terms of how that plant forms, right, from that individual cell, like I said, that we were starting with, okay? It says here, cell suspension culture. So these calluses here, this undifferentiated cells will form a callus first. Again, if we talk about undifferentiated cells, these are the stem cells, okay? You could grow that callus and basically you can cut them into small pieces and shake them into a liquid nutrient medium, and then you form that suspension, okay? And so you can then extract chemicals and things like that from the cells. So it's just a way of getting at those cells. So apparently, there are certain plants that will produce, chemicals that are useful to us. So this is a specific species, digitalis, that will produce drugs that are used to treat heart disease. And so a way of extracting that chemical can be done in the lab. Okay, so you kind of get part of that plant to grow, right? Not necessarily the whole thing, and then you break it up and you can extract those chemicals there, right? So this is what it's saying. It will avoid over collection of wild plants, right? You can just, again, sort of simulate this in the lab, and it's not really the full development, and pull out what you need, okay? And so this is actually kind of showing you this here. So these are these sort of calluses that can form, showing you just in a flask, and then you can break those up and again extract what you want. Okay, and actually, and showing you some of these other sort of, this is growth. This kind of right. This looks like sort of like an agar type of media that you see that growing in. Okay, and so other ones as well. So there are many scientists that work on genetically modifying. Again, even if you genetically modified that plant to produce or to enhance that chemical that it produced and then extract it and use it for something, right? There are many uses for genetically modifying plants and also for growing them in the lab. And yes, that is the last slide.